Every autumn, it amazes me how nature begins its process of letting go. The vibrant colors of fall create a breathtaking spectacle that draws crowds to witness its beauty. But have you ever stopped to consider what's truly happening during this time? There's a profound beauty in this cycle of life and death, a beauty that often goes unnoticed. Yet, mystics, those deeply attuned to the nature of existence, see it clearly, and they all converge around one core idea: the eternal. A cycle has no end. Imagine a straight line with a beginning and an end. Now, if you connect those 2 points, the line forms a circle. That circle represents wholeness and eternity, with no true starting or stopping point. In the natural cycle, autumn is an active period of release, removing, destroying, and clearing away. Its opposite, spring, is a time of addition, growth, renewal, and filling. Autumn leads into the still barren cold of winter. Just as summer contrasts winter with its warmth and abundance, together these seasons form a continuous cycle of transformation, each phase reflecting different expressions of the same nature, all pointing back to the eternal rhythm of life itself. I start with this reflection to introduce what I call the eternal psychic factor. Part of this idea relates to the concept of the self, a term used by psychologist Carl Jung to describe the wholeness of our psyche, the entirety of our mind. I'll delve more into this shortly, but for now, let's return to the fall. Ask yourself, what are you witnessing as it fades and dies? Nature in its essence, the life force animating everything, is not dying. We know that the cycle continues, from winter into spring and then summer. So, what exactly is falling away? Think about it. It's the creations of nature that are falling. Its fruits, its leaves. People are drawn instinctively to the beauty of this process because, whether they realize it or not, they sense that every ending in nature is also a new beginning. But when this same idea is applied to their own lives, the shedding of attachments, beliefs, addictions, identities, emotional patterns, and the like, people often resist. Letting go of a constructed reality is one of the greatest struggles. There is nothing more natural than becoming your true self. Yet, ironically, there is nothing more challenging than truly knowing yourself. I aim to explore the dynamics between the ego and the self, the subjective and objective mind. We'll look at their relationship, the archetypes and complexes that bridge the two, and what it truly means to fall. And of course, I'll draw on the wisdom of Carl Jung to guide this exploration. The terms ego and self are just labels. They don't mean anything by themselves. They're meant to point towards something invisible, something we can't physically see. When we call something green, we understand it because we can visually see the color. Sure, we can break it down scientifically and explain it in terms of light wavelengths, but the word green still ties to something visible and concrete. With the terms like ego and self, however, there's no visible counterpart. This makes it easy to bring our own preconceived ideas to these terms. For example, many people associate the ego with selfishness or narcissism. Others might see the self as their higher self or their true essence. In Jungian psychology, the ego refers to the subject, the individual who acts, wills, and is at the center of conscious awareness. The self, on the other hand, represents the totality of consciousness, including both the conscious and unconscious. These are complex ideas, but understanding them requires us to grasp the invisible forces these labels describe. So, where should we begin? Ego or self? Let's start with the self, which can be tied to the beginning of consciousness itself. Think about it. Just as there's a shared biological process to being born, there's also a shared psychological process. At birth, we are completely unaware. Yet in that unawareness, there is a deeper awareness. A pure collective consciousness that serves as the foundation for everything we build upon later. In Jungian terms, this is the collective unconscious, filled with latent potentials and archetypes waiting to be realized. Take a newborn, for example. On their first day, they have no concept of good or evil, right or wrong. In terms of awareness, they are as open and pure as it gets, but they lack consciousness. They have not yet discriminated enough to form a sense of I am. They are carried, fed, and cared for by others. It isn't until they transition from being carried to carrying themselves, learning to walk, speak, and act on their own, that they begin to recognize their own awareness and develop a sense of self. Here, we see the difference between awareness and consciousness. In the beginning, everything is shared. We are all equally unaware, unable to walk, speak, or act with intention. Reflecting on this early state of unconsciousness helps us see beyond the surface differences between people. If you strip away race, gender, nationality, and all the visual markers of identity, what remains is a common humanity. We all share the same basic biology: a heart, a mind, 2 feet. This fundamental unity ties us together, not just physically, but also psychologically, as beings capable of awareness and growth. When you look past all the psychological labels, identities, beliefs, ideologies, personality types, and complexes, you'll find a shared fluid that makes up all of our consciousness. This common essence is what allows all of us to experience thoughts, emotions, and feelings like love or anger. We wouldn't be able to share these experiences if there weren't something universal at the core of our being. This shared essence is the self, and it exists within both you and me. The only difference is how the self unfolds, influenced by both external circumstances, objective factors, and internal perceptions, subjective factors. We all start as the self, rooted in a pure state of awareness. But as we grow and begin to differentiate ourselves, we shift away from this original conscious center and create a new center, the ego. This happens as we develop independence, from being carried to carrying ourselves, from being fed to feeding ourselves, from crawling to walking, and from simply existing, I am, to forming an identity, I am me. However, even as the ego takes center stage, the self doesn't disappear. It remains in the background, unconsciously aware, existing in the deeper psychic realm. Over time, we lose sight of this true psychic center because we get drawn into the visible material world. We start building ideas, images, and beliefs about ourselves and everything around us. This process gives rise to 2 powerful archetypal complexes that we all face: the persona and the shadow. The persona is the mask we present to the world, our social identity, how we want others to see us. But as we construct this outward image, anything that doesn't align with it gets pushed away and becomes part of the shadow. The shadow represents the parts of ourselves we reject or deny, the traits and feelings we refuse to acknowledge. This dynamic stems from the ego, which is the first and central complex from which all other complexes are formed. In Carl Jung's model of the psyche, the ego develops early in life and lays the foundation for how we consciously navigate the world. Now, let's revisit the self. While the ego creates complexes like the persona and shadow, the self operates through its own innate patterns, which Jung called archetypes. One key archetype of the self is the archetype of wholeness. This reflects the universal truth that life is a balance of opposites, joy and despair, light and darkness, good and bad. If someone strives only for happiness and ignores the possibility of sadness, they unintentionally build the conditions for unhappiness. This is what I call the law of wholeness. The more we emphasize one side, the more its opposite grows in the background. For example, the more outwardly manly a person becomes, the more their soul compensates by embracing feminine qualities internally. We see this balancing principle in nature all the time. Think of a rainstorm. Storms form because of imbalances in the atmosphere, and the storm itself is nature's way of restoring equilibrium. Once the storm passes, the sky is clear and balance is regained. The same process happens within us, psychologically, when we experience internal turmoil, mental storms, so to speak. Our psyche is trying to rebalance itself. A nightmare, for example, can be seen as the mind's way of addressing an imbalance. But many people ignore these signs from their dreams and their unconscious mind, leaving themselves in a constant state of psychological imbalance. Over time, this mental disharmony doesn't just stay in the mind, it spills over into the body. Stress from unresolved mental disturbances manifests physically, creating tension, illness, and discomfort. In both nature and our psyche, balance is the goal. But to achieve it, we must acknowledge and work through the storms within us instead of ignoring them. Only then can we reclaim clarity and harmony, both mentally and physically. Let's take a moment to break down some important points about the ego, starting with a quote from Carl Jung. This isn't just any random quote, but the very first sentence of his work, Aion. Investigation of the psychology of the unconscious confronted me with facts which required the formulation of new concepts. One of these concepts is the self. The entity so denoted is not meant to take the place of the one that has always been known as the ego, but includes it in a supraordinate concept. We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness. And insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content could be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. Simply, Jung is saying that the ego is central to our conscious awareness. It's the part of us that organizes and relates to everything we experience consciously. While the self represents the totality of our psyche, both conscious and unconscious, the ego is a smaller, more specific center. Without the ego, consciousness wouldn't exist, because there would be no subject to perceive anything. Think about your earliest memory. How far back can you go? Most of us hit a foggy period in early childhood that we can't remember. This is because at that stage, we hadn't yet developed a sense of being separate from everything around us. The ego hadn't fully formed yet. And without that, there's no differentiation, no I to reflect on or remember anything. Some people talk about killing the ego or claim that the ego is an illusion. But let's think about what life would be like without it. Without the ego, you couldn't speak, grow, or develop. There would be no conscious awareness. The ego isn't the problem. It's actually the mechanism through which the self transforms potential into reality. This, in my opinion, is the meaning behind the alchemical paradox. The beginning is the end. In the beginning, there's a raw, undeveloped state, while the end represents an awakened, refined state. But this transformation requires the ego. As I mentioned earlier, the natural development of consciousness leads to the self. However, the ego often stands in the way because it gets caught up in its own attachments and illusions. Yet, paradoxically, without the ego, the self would remain only a potential, never actualized. The psyche is energy, and energy is never created or destroyed. It simply changes form. At the start, there's the potential for wholeness, the self. And at the end, there's its realization. But the missing link that makes this possible is the ego operating in the world of creation. To go deeper, the relationship between the ego and the self mirrors the relationship between complexes and archetypes. The ego is like a smaller subjective awareness within the larger objective awareness of the self. Similarly, a complex is a smaller construct built from an archetype. Archetypes are universal patterns of potential energy, present from the very beginning. Complexes, on the other hand, are formed by the actions and experiences of the ego. Here's the key difference. Archetypes are eternal. They can't be removed from our psyche because they're part of its foundation. Complexes, however, are created through personal experience and can therefore be dissolved. This distinction invites us to reflect deeply. While we can't erase the archetypal patterns that shape our inner world, we can work to identify and dissolve the complexes that block our growth. Complexes are not permanent. They're simply energy bound by our subjective awareness. When we confront them, we free up that energy and move closer to the wholeness of the self. It's fascinating how unaware we are as humans when it comes to the deeper workings of our own minds. Thinking about archetypes and complexes really highlights this. Let's start with archetypes by using a simple example. Think about something as basic as the ability to walk. Walking is a biological potential built into every human being. Without needing formal teaching or conscious understanding, children eventually figure it out. There's an instinctual intelligence already present, an archetype of walking, so to speak. As a child interacts with the world, this potential becomes actualized, turning into a skill. And once walking is mastered, it opens the door to even higher functions like running. This natural process is so common that we rarely think about it. Yet while we instinctively develop biological potentials like walking, we often neglect to explore the inner psychological archetypes that exist within us. These aren't tied to our biology, but to our psyche. Take love, for example. Love is something universal, an instinct for connection and unity. But if this archetype remains undeveloped or misunderstood, it can manifest in distorted forms. Without self-awareness, love can devolve into lust, attachment, or dependency, creating all kinds of struggles in our conscious lives. As a society, we've made tremendous strides in physical and material development, but we've largely ignored the inner world of the psyche. Part of this neglect stems from our ignorance of our own deeply rooted psychological instincts and archetypes. Psychology, which should be the field that studies the psyche objectively, has often focused more on the ego and its distortions than on the deeper universal aspects of the mind. There's nothing wrong with studying the ego. This is an important part of understanding ourselves. But what about the other side of the psyche? The part that connects us to something greater, something eternal. This other side of the mind is what Jung called the objective psyche. It's the part of us tied to the collective and universal aspects of consciousness. Science has given us incredible tools and knowledge about the physical world, but when it comes to the inner world of the mind, we're still fumbling in the dark. This is often left to those interested in religion, spirituality, philosophy, and mysticism. Yet, even in these diverse fields, the stories, symbols, and myths they produce all share an archetypal foundation. That's why anyone who studies Jung's work quickly sees countless examples of these universal patterns. Jung himself was deeply interested in this collective, objective psyche. While many focus on how the ego can distort our inner experiences, Jung turned his attention to the essence itself. He sought to understand the heart of the psyche, not just its surface-level distortions. A great example of his work in this area is the Red Book, where Jung documented his personal journey into the depths of his inner world. Through his willingness to set aside his ego and explore these deeper layers, he encountered archetypal figures and symbols, much like what happens in a dream. Jung's approach shows us that the psyche is not just a chaotic mess of thoughts and emotions, but a structured space filled with universal patterns waiting to be understood. By opening ourselves to this inner exploration, we can begin to connect with these archetypes and better understand the forces shaping our conscious and unconscious lives. Outside of our ego, there's a part of the psyche that holds unconscious or semi-conscious energy, quietly waiting for our attention. If we don't pay attention to it, it remains untouched. Yet it still influences us in the same undeveloped way it exists. This is why understanding archetypes is so important. They are deeply connected to how consciousness works, even though they reside in the unconscious. When activated, archetypes influence us either instinctively or consciously, shaping how we think and act. Jung explained this concept beautifully, showing how archetypes link to natural patterns. The term archetype is not meant to denote an inherited idea, but rather an inherited mode of functioning, corresponding to the inborn way in which the chick emerges from the egg, the bird builds its nest. A certain kind of wasp stings the motor ganglion of the caterpillar, and eels find their way to the Bermudas. In other words, it is a pattern of behavior. This means that archetypes are like built-in blueprints for how certain things unfold within us, much like instinctual behaviors in animals. They provide an unconscious structure that guides us even when we don't realize it. Through this structure, we begin to discover not just who we are, but what we are on a deeper level. This is where we see that outside of our personal will, there's another force within the mind, an objective intelligence that moves through us and influences us, whether we like it or not. At first, this might seem overwhelming, but consider this. If this deeper intelligence has been a part of us long before we formed opinions and ideas, maybe it has something valuable to teach us. And the best way to connect with archetypes is not by overanalyzing them, but by experiencing them directly. Archetypes manifest through you, not because someone tells you about them. When you consciously engage with them, you grow, and they also grow through your awareness. This is the lesson Jung explored in the Red Book, the power of doing the inner work. The ego plays a crucial role in this process. Without conscious awareness, the deeper layers of the psyche, where instincts and reflexes lie, stay stuck in an undeveloped, childlike state. It's like a seed that never gets the chance to sprout. Without this growth, people repeat the same patterns over and over, unable to evolve or expand their consciousness. Here's the key. You can't get rid of archetypes. They're eternal and must be developed. On the other hand, complexes, those patterns of emotional or mental distortions we build around experiences, can be dissolved. Archetypes are universal, but complexes are personal, shaped by our individual lives. And it's in the space of the personal unconscious, where these complexes live, that the real inner work begins. By facing and dissolving those complexes, we create room to engage with the deeper, eternal archetypes and let our consciousness grow. It's easy to dismiss the ego or downplay its role in consciousness. Some people even entertain the idea of killing the ego as part of their spiritual journey. The same thing happens with complexes. They're often misunderstood, ignored, or oversimplified. But here's the problem. We've trapped ourselves within these complexes, and as long as we're stuck in them, every search for enlightenment, balance, or healing becomes a dead end. People look outside themselves for answers. A savior, a religion, a guru, a therapist, or some external discipline they think will fix them. This tendency to look outward for fulfillment applies to everything, not just spiritual growth. We think, if I just get this job, this relationship, this car, this level of fame or success, then I'll be happy, then I'll be at peace. But even when those goals are achieved, the underlying situation within us, the unique complex we carry, remains unchanged. It sits there like dormant energy, waiting to resurface and play out the same old patterns. True self-knowledge doesn't come from chasing something outside ourselves. It starts by turning inward, facing what is, not what we want it to be. Within that reality lies a piece of us, a reflection of our deeper psyche. Complexes, no matter how they're defined or named, are nothing more than splintered fragments of the whole psyche. They hold a part of the energy that belongs to the self, and that energy doesn't disappear. It's just trapped, waiting to be acknowledged and reintegrated. Jung explained this beautifully. He saw complexes as split-off parts of the psyche that, while unconscious or semi-conscious, are still connected to the larger system of consciousness. To truly grow, we have to confront these complexes because they hold valuable information. By working through them, we release their trapped energy, allowing it to return to the totality of the self. This process creates space for higher states of consciousness to emerge. I was reminded of this while reflecting on Jung's writings. Shortly after jotting down these thoughts, I opened his Mysterium Conjunctionis and came across a passage that felt like a confirmation of these ideas. In paragraph 283, Jung wrote, "It is worth noting that the animal is the symbolic carrier of the self. This hint in myth expresses the fact that the structure of wholeness was always present, but was buried in profound unconsciousness, where it can be found again if one is willing to risk one's skin to obtain the greatest possible range of consciousness through the greatest possible self-knowledge. A harsh and bitter drink, usually reserved for hell. The throne of God seems to be no unworthy reward for such trials, for self-knowledge, in the total meaning of the word, is not a one-sided intellectual pastime, but a journey through the 4 continents, where one is exposed to all the dangers of land, sea, air, and fire." This passage highlights the difficulty and bravery required for self-knowledge. It's not about intellectual exercises or shallow introspection. It's about facing the full range of our inner world, including the pain, fear, and resistance. To reclaim wholeness, we must journey through the raw terrain of our unconscious, confronting the complexities within ourselves. It's challenging, even perilous, but the reward, the integration of our true self, is worth every trial. To truly recognize something in its entirety, we must embrace all its aspects, every angle, every detail, without leaving anything out. Ignatius Loyola once recommended using the imagination through the 5 senses during meditation, asking the practitioner to imitate Christ using all their senses. The goal wasn't just moral growth, but a deeper realization of the object being contemplated. This type of meditation trains the mind to focus, pay attention, and think clearly. Similar results can be found in forms of yoga, which also aim to cultivate concentration and awareness. However, unlike these traditional methods, which often involve projecting oneself into an idealized form or image, true self-knowledge requires turning inward and confronting ourselves exactly as we are. This means seeing our ego in its raw, unfiltered state. Not the polished, idealized version we wish to be, but the messy, imperfect self with all its flaws, thoughts, and actions. Many people avoid this process because it's uncomfortable. In Eastern philosophy, the ego is often dismissed as an illusion, while in the West, it's symbolically offered up as a sacrifice to Christ. Either way, people tend to want to escape it rather than face it. This concept ties deeply into the idea of self-knowledge and the complexes we carry. True self-awareness isn't possible without acknowledging the ego and its hidden patterns. Just as a flower can't grow without its roots and stem, and a mathematician can't do advanced calculations without first learning basic arithmetic, we can't truly know ourselves without confronting our complexes. Here's the challenge. Complexes operate through our consciousness, but they're often not something we've consciously created. They may have formed in childhood or during a time we weren't fully aware of what was happening. Yet, despite their unconscious origin, they remain within us. And while this might sound like a burden, it's also an opportunity. Complexes don't disappear. They stay with us, waiting to be acknowledged. If we don't face them, they'll continue to affect us, even haunting us for our entire lives. But once we recognize and understand them, they can change. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow comes in, representing the personal unconscious where these hidden parts of us reside, to help visualize how complexes function and affect us. Imagine them as a bow and arrow. Every complex has a central idea or theme, but this core is often hard to see because it gets buried under layers of emotions, images, and associations. This core, the root of the complex, is like the bow, a stable structure around which everything else revolves. It holds the energy drawn to it by the emotional impact of the initial experience that created the complex. The energy fuels the complex, keeping it active and alive, ready to be triggered into our conscious awareness. When triggered, the complex fires, much like releasing the tension in the bow to shoot an arrow. This release can bring the complex into our awareness, often through intense emotions, reactions, or recurring patterns in our behavior. But by understanding the structure and root of our complexes, we gain the ability to work with them, to release their hold, and to integrate them into our broader self-awareness. This is where true growth begins, by confronting and transforming the hidden parts of ourselves. The feeling tone of a complex is like a bow, string, and arrow. The string represents tension, which increases the potential energy as it's pulled back further. The arrow carries the psychic or intelligent energy of the complex and is aimed at conscious awareness. This energy includes thoughts, emotions, behavioral patterns, or reflexes. Anything tied to the complex that overtakes a person's will. The entire system, bow, string, and arrow, is located in the personal unconscious, with the arrow pointed at the conscious mind or ego. For a complex's energy to reach consciousness, it needs to be triggered. This can happen through an external stimulus, like a person, place, or music, or it can emerge from within when the conscious mind is inactive, such as during dreams or meditation. When the complex becomes active, it overwhelms the conscious mind with its own energy, emotions, and intelligence. It essentially lives itself through conscious awareness, regardless of the ego's preferences or judgments. Transformation is only possible when the complex reveals itself as it is and the ego experiences it fully. As the arrow heads toward consciousness, there are 5 possible outcomes. These represent the kinetic side of the complex as opposed to its potential energy. Out of these 5 outcomes, only one allows for transformation. The first response by the ego is rejection. The ego tries to avoid the complex by distracting itself with entertainment, substances, food, or other activities. However, rejecting the complex doesn't make it disappear. Instead, its energy returns to the personal unconscious, unresolved. The unconscious doesn't forget or dismiss it. It simply stores the energy until it surfaces again. The second response is projection. Here, the complex is allowed to express itself in consciousness, but the ego shifts its energy onto someone or something else. This means the complex plays out, but the ego doesn't recognize it as part of itself. While this is slightly better for consciousness than rejection, the complex still returns to the unconscious without resolution, as its true nature isn't integrated or understood. The third way the ego reacts to a complex is through possession. This means the person becomes so absorbed in the complex's energy and emotions that they can't see beyond it. While this might sound strange, it's actually a small step forward in awareness. By letting the complex play itself out, the energy gets expressed. However, because the person is caught up in it, they can't see it clearly or gain understanding. For the unconscious, this is another agreement with the complex, and the energy returns to its source in the personal unconscious, still unresolved. In all 3 of these reactions, rejection, projection, and possession, people remain stuck in the grip of their complexes. These reactions feed the complex's energy or reinforce its hold on the person. To move toward transformation, a person needs to develop greater awareness and a strong will. This is no easy task because complexes can't be forced to appear. They have to activate on their own. While meditation is helpful, it's in the everyday experiences of life that these trapped energies are more likely to surface. The fourth possible reaction to a complex is reflection. Reflection happens after the complex has already been activated and has returned to the unconscious. In this case, the person gains awareness of the complex by looking back on what happened. They may begin to recognize how the complex influences their behavior or emotions. While reflection doesn't transform the complex in the moment, it increases self-awareness and helps the person prepare to handle the complex differently the next time it becomes active. The fifth and final reaction, where true transformation is possible, is catching the arrow in the moment. This means the person recognizes the complex as it's happening and doesn't reject it, project it, become possessed by it, or only reflect on it later. Instead, they consciously engage with the complex without letting it take over. When this happens, the energy of the complex is transformed and returned to its true source, the self, not the unconscious. Though confronting complexes can feel unpleasant or even painful, they hold a kind of personal intelligence that helps us grow. Without facing these challenges, there's no deeper self-awareness, no inner growth, and no movement toward individuation, becoming our true selves. Finally, there's a bigger connection between all these ideas, the relationship between the ego, the self, and the unconscious. If the ego is the center of conscious awareness and the self is the totality of both conscious and unconscious, what's at the heart of the unconscious? This missing link ties everything together. To visualize it, imagine a triangle. The self sits at the top point, representing wholeness. At the two lower points are the ego, conscious mind, and the unconscious. The triangle helps us see beyond dualities and move toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and the archetypal patterns that shape our inner lives. Through this perspective, the journey of self-awareness and transformation becomes a path toward greater wholeness. Let's take the archetype of the mother as an example. At the top of the triangle is the universal idea of the mother, the archetype itself. Below it are two opposites, the nurturing, loving, great mother, and the harsh, punishing, evil mother. When we view this triangle, it helps us see the whole picture and stay centered. If we only focus on the positive side, the great mother, we might deny the negative side, but the archetype contains both. To truly grow and develop, we need to embrace the whole of it. True intelligence and wholeness come from accepting both the light and dark within ourselves. The self, as Jung described, is a whole made up of opposites. It includes everything, light and dark, beauty and ugliness, order and chaos, higher and lower, masculine and feminine, active and passive. By reflecting on the triangle, we can begin to see and understand these different shades of our being. Now, let's revisit the missing piece in this concept. If the self is the whole, the source of all opposites, and the conscious ego represents one part of this, what do we call the unconscious? For the sake of this explanation, let's call the unconscious the soul. This term carries many meanings, but here it represents the hidden unconscious part of ourselves. The soul is deeply connected to who we are and holds much of our inner truth. The ego on its own cannot fully know itself without the soul. It's through interacting with the soul that self-awareness begins to unfold. To illustrate this, imagine a man and a woman. Each has their own conscious ego, their awareness, and their own unconscious soul. These two individuals also share a connection to the same larger whole, the self, the essence of all existence. Archetypal forces, like love and relationships, guide the souls of both the man and the woman toward one another. Now, imagine the man has a complex related to love that formed in his childhood. This complex, which resides in his soul, influences how he views love and relationships. When he meets a woman who stirs this part of his unconscious, his soul projects an image of her into his conscious awareness. This image isn't based on who the woman truly is, but on the man's own inner complex and emotions. The man doesn't see the real woman. He sees the soul's projection of her. This process happens automatically, without the man's intention or awareness. If the man and woman form a relationship, over time the man may begin to see the woman for who she really is, and the projection fades. When this happens, what he thought was love may disappear because it was based on the illusion created by his soul. As the illusion fades, the true essence of the woman begins to shine through. For the man to truly see the woman as she is, he must turn inward and face the source of the projection, his soul. Jung referred to this as incest, but not in the literal sense. It's a metaphor for uniting with one's own soul, awakening to its truths, and integrating it into conscious awareness. This union brings the self closer to wholeness and allows one to see others and oneself more clearly. Think about those moments when you look back and wonder why you acted a certain way, especially in situations that catch you off guard. You didn't choose to act like that. If you had, you wouldn't be confused about it later. And even if you wanted to act differently, there's often no time to think or plan in those moments. They just happen. If it wasn't a deliberate choice from you, then what part of you acted? You could call that part your soul. It's easy to look back at our past actions with anger, shame, or denial. But whether you like those actions or not, they're still part of you. When you can face yourself honestly, including the parts you'd rather reject, something amazing happens. You start to see the beauty, even in moments you thought were ugly. As much as your soul may act out in ways you don't understand or like, it also protects you. It's what saves lives in emergencies, gives you strength beyond what seems possible, and slows down time so you can make decisions your conscious mind couldn't handle. There's a deep intelligence within it. There's a hidden force within us. A quiet, steady presence that seems to take over when we face life's most intense moments. You might call it intuition, soul, or just an inner knowing. Whatever it is, it often shows up when our conscious mind isn't fast enough to keep up. I've had a couple of experiences that made me stop and wonder about this deeper intelligence. One time, I was hiking along a steep trail, the kind where a single misstep could send you tumbling down the side of a mountain. As I navigated a narrow, slippery section, my foot suddenly slipped on loose gravel. Before I could think, my body shifted, arms out, knees bent, regaining balance in an instant. That movement wasn't planned or calculated. It felt like something beyond me knew exactly what to do. If I had fallen, the consequences could have been life-threatening. But somehow I stayed upright, as if guided by an unseen hand. Another time, I was driving when a car suddenly pulled out in front of me. I couldn't stop in time, and the collision seemed unavoidable. Yet in those few seconds, it felt like time stretched out. Options flashed through my mind: swerve left into a ditch, swerve right and take the hit on my driver's side. I adjusted the wheel just enough for the impact to hit the passenger side instead. The car was totaled, but I walked away unhurt. Looking back, it's hard to explain how I made those decisions so quickly, almost without effort. These moments taught me that there's more to us than logic or instinct. It's like nature planted a deeper wisdom inside us, something that knows what to do when chaos strikes. But here's the thing, most of us are too caught up in our egos to notice it. We chase comfort, avoid pain, and cling to habits that keep us stuck. The soul's intelligence isn't about making life easy. It's about guiding us toward balance, even if that means facing hard truths. Carl Jung described this process as a kind of fall, not a failure, but a letting go of the ego's illusions. It's like peeling away layers of fear, attachment, and pride to get to the core of who we really are. This isn't about chasing good vibes or avoiding discomfort. It's about accepting all parts of ourselves, even the messy ones, and finding a wholeness that doesn't rely on external approval. When we tap into this deeper intelligence, we see life differently. It's not about controlling everything or always having the right answer. It's about trusting that, even in the chaos, there's a force within us that knows the way forward. That's the soul at work, a silent guide we all have, waiting for us to listen. The fall is an emptying, a surrender of the ego's hold. Think of the Christian ritual of baptism. Being lowered into water represents the ego being submerged, cleansed, and purified by the soul. The soul is a reservoir of intelligence, rooted in the self and in nature, in something eternal. But it's often buried under the clutter of the ego's illusions, attachments, and complexes. This process of purification also reveals the consequences of what we've created through our own actions, thoughts, and beliefs. Yes, your circumstances might be hard. Yes, others may have wronged you. And yes, life often feels unfair. But nature, consciousness, and eternity don't concern themselves with excuses or victimhood. If you stay stuck in self-pity or blame, that deeper intelligence will push you to confront the truth until you're willing to let go of those illusions. This process isn't easy, but it's transformative. When the ego steps aside and makes room for the soul, a deeper intelligence and balance emerge. It's a return to wholeness, a state where the conscious mind and the unconscious work together rather than at odds to align with the greater essence of life itself. It's easy to lose touch with your soul, to become what people call a lost soul. But when you reconnect with it, the healing that follows is unlike anything a doctor or medication could ever provide. This kind of healing goes deeper. It's a realignment of your inner self and even your body with something greater. You start to see how intelligent and connected you truly are, not just to other people, but to the world and the universe itself. You also begin to understand why others act the way they do, often driven by their own lost souls. And once you see the illusion that so many live under, you begin to glimpse the truth behind it all. People can dress up their lives with all the glitter they want. Money, designer clothes, makeup, flashy cars, or fancy gadgets. These things might impress someone who's disconnected from their soul. But for anyone who has reconnected with their essence, all that superficial shine becomes meaningless. You see right through it. If you've made it this far into this message, you're likely someone who's already stepping outside the illusion and back into yourself. That intelligence you're rediscovering cuts through the noise and distractions the world tries to offer. Remember the earlier example of the union between the conscious mind and the soul? When this connection happens, the soul stops projecting false images onto others. Instead, it recognizes the truth of the person behind the surface. You begin to sense their soul directly, not just the masks they wear. To truly see this unity, that we are all connected as one, you first have to understand the two parts, the ego and the soul. The journey to know thyself is about navigating between them. But beware of the external world. It's filled with forces, wolves, if you will, that prey on your essence, turning you into a perfect consumer, obedient to the propaganda of the time. If you remain true to your essence and let it grow, you'll see through these wolves. And you'll also understand the sheep who blindly follow them. You'll see why the wolves act as they do and why the sheep allow it. To live in harmony with nature, you must go through the fall. I went through my own fall a few years ago because I was tired of living half-truths. Half-truths are like complexes. They feel real and can completely take over, but they aren't truly real. I was exhausted from living a life that made me and those around me sick. I saw so many people drained and lifeless, giving away their essence to a system that leaves everyone empty. But when I let go of the illusions, I realized something profound. Life itself is enough. Everything we sense, what we see, hear, taste, touch, smell, and feel, is part of that greater intelligence. And because this essence is already within us, no person, government, belief system, or myth can give it to us. It's been there all along, waiting for us to remember it. Let me leave you with a quote from Jung that reflects on why consciousness exists in the first place. He wrote, "Man only knows a small part of his psyche, just as he has only a limited knowledge of how his body functions. The forces that shape his psychic life mostly come from unconscious processes beyond his awareness. Similarly, there are deeper purposes and goals at work, also rooted in the unconscious. Freud's psychology shows evidence of these causal forces, while Adler's demonstrates the purposeful ones. These causes and purposes go far beyond what we are conscious of, and their power shouldn't be underestimated. As long as they remain unconscious, they act upon us unchallenged. It is only through conscious insight and moral determination that they can be understood and transformed. Which is why self-knowledge, though so essential, is often so deeply feared. If we rephrase this without its theological language, the meaning becomes clearer. Consciousness was created so that we could recognize our connection to something greater, a higher unity. Its purpose is to guide us to honor that source, to act with intelligence and responsibility, and to help the psyche as a whole grow and thrive to its fullest potential. Consciousness is a gift, a profound experience that shapes our lifetime. But how we use it, how we distort it, and how we harm others because of those distortions can be as devastating as life itself is beautiful. We often grab and take from the world for our own gain, yet the deeper call is to let go, to fall and to reconnect with what is real and whole. Thank you for listening.